Could you discuss the case of Professor Finkelstein then? What your
Which case? The case at DePaul?
The fact that he has been he lost tenure and the kind of witch hunts and the kind of suppression of free speech in his case?
Well, I've known Norman since, must be 25 years or so, since he started working on his Joan Peters work. And as I'm sure he told you, he was a graduate student at that time at Princeton. And he was, when the Peters book came out, and it received just rave reviews everywhere. He was studying history of Zionism. He's a very careful and assiduous scholar. He was surprised by her conclusions, started looking through her sources, and found that, in his words, it was a hoax. I don't know if that word is correct, but it certainly couldn't stand up to investigation. So he wrote a paper and sent it around to, I think he said, 30 people or so, asking whether they thought he should continue with this, what's worth investigating. He told me that he only got one answer from me. And what I told him is, it's an interesting topic, but if you investigate it, you're probably going to destroy your career. The reason is not so much that you're exposing this book, which wouldn't matter very much, but you're going to be exposing the American intellectual class, because the book had received rave reviews. Everybody loved the conclusion. I mean, it sort of eliminated any moral issue about limitless support for Israeli takeover of territories, elimination of the Palestinians, and that was the standard view. So here we have a moral basis for it. So the book got absolutely rave reviews. And what I told him, he probably has the letter, that if you pursue this, you'll be exposing all of these people, and they're not going to like it. And the intellectual world is not an attractive world. There's a lot of ugly characteristics, and they'll go after you. He decided to pursue it, and I said, if you do it with eyes open, not thinking you're just writing an article. So he did. He went ahead. He wrote an article for publication. He circulated it. Nobody would touch it. Finally, meanwhile, the book was going through printing after printing. Finally, the publishers made a tactical error. They allowed the book to appear in England. As soon as I heard that it was going to appear in England, I sent Norman's work to friends of mine in England who are journalists, scholars, work on Middle East issues, and I told them, you should be interested in this. When the book came out in England, it was massacred by scholars, journalists, the main journals, and so on. American intellectuals read the British reviews, and there was a lot of embarrassment. And at that point, still nobody would touch, and they cited Norman's work, or used, a lot of it was just used, even without citation. Well, various things happened here, but probably Norman described them to you. I don't want to do it secondhand. But what I anticipated pretty much happened. He was persona non grata among the people who he had exposed as being essentially charlatans. Then comes along history. He wrote a series of books. They were praised by people who knew the field, like Raoul Hilberg, who's the leading historian of the Holocaust, in fact initiated Holocaust studies, and was pretty conservative. Said he agreed that his conclusions were well-founded, and evidence was solid, and so on. Then came the DePaul incident. That was a kind of a separate case. He had published another book called Beyond Chutzpah, in which he went after Alan Dershowitz, law professor at Harvard, and the book itself is a very careful analysis of Israeli human rights violations and of the diplomatic history and so on. And what he pointed out in passing is the framing of the book is a response to Dershowitz's apologetics for these crimes, and he exposed them very carefully and explicitly and with unchallengeable evidence. Well, Dershowitz is no fool. He knew he couldn't respond, so he did what comes natural to him, try to destroy the author, and then started a campaign of, I mean, first of all, Dershowitz pulled out every stop to try to get the book from being published. He even wrote to the governor of California telling him to intervene to stop University of California Press from publishing it. Norman was coming out for tenure at that time. Dershowitz, he denies all this, incidentally, but it's pretty well. You can read it in the Chronicle of Higher Education. He launched a campaign to try to block his tenure. It never mentioned the book, of course. It's trying to avoid that. He wants Norman's review of the book, Norman's book, to disappear. He doesn't want to respond to it. He couldn't respond to it. And a campaign of vilification, slander, you know, Holocaust denier, every charge you can think of. And the department, the faculty actually approved his appointment, but the administration, plainly under pressure, overruled the faculty vote and rescinded it.
Okay. To ask you, how was the Holocaust exploited as a political tool? What's your take on that? Mr. Finkelstein talks about it a bit, but what are your feelings?
I mean, it is so obvious that it's hard even to discuss. I mean, just take a look at the concern about the Holocaust, say in the United States, but it's duplicated elsewhere, Israel too. There was a time when it made sense to be concerned about the Holocaust. I'm old enough to remember it very vividly. First of all, before the war, when you could have saved potential Holocaust victims. And they were kept out of the country, driven back to Europe. The case of the St. Louis is a famous one. The conferences on refugees, Evian and elsewhere, the main conclusion was send them somewhere else. We don't want to bother with them. So if they get slaughtered, that's their problem. After the you could argue during the war that maybe there were higher priorities. Okay, but I don't agree, but you could argue that. After the war, there were no higher priorities. In 1945, Holocaust survivors were living in concentration camps under miserable conditions, not much different from the war, except that the crematoria and the gas chambers weren't functioning. Truman actually sent a commission, a Harrison Commission, to investigate the camps and came back with awful reports about what was going on in the camps. Well, ask yourself a simple question. How many of the survivors of the Holocaust from the camps came to the United States? A trickle. How many would have wanted to come to the United States? Well, we don't actually know, but half of Europe would have wanted to come to the United States at that point for obvious reasons. And survivors of the death camps, it's very likely that a large number of them, probably maybe most of them, would have come here if they had a chance. Well, they didn't have a chance for two reasons. One reason, which is by now well documented in Hebrew and in English, is that the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, was pre-Israel, had essentially taken over the camps. And they wanted to ensure that they had actually, they controlled the camps, meaning they controlled food and so on. They basically ran them. And their goal was straightforward: get the able-bodied ones to go to Palestine. In fact, there's a book which in the Hebrew translation, it's called Good Human Material. It appeared in English with some other title, I forget what. The phrase good human material comes from the doctrine that people, able-bodied men and women from 17 to 35, have to go to Palestine, basically cannon fodder, and the rest we'll use for propaganda. So that's one reason why they didn't come here. The other reason, which is more important for us, is that the Americans didn't want them. They did not want them to come. The American Jewish community didn't want them to come. There was practically no lobby. Actually, there was an immigration bill, the Stratton immigration bill, but as far as I recall, the only elements of the Jewish community that lobbied for it were the anti-Zionist groups, the Council for Judaism, Blessing Rosenwald, anti-Zionism. Well, you know, that was a time when you could have saved Holocaust survivors. Nobody cared. In fact, it was negative. We don't want them. Then you look through the 50s, and Holocaust is barely discussed. It's not much of an issue. Eichmann trial, there's a little tick, there's some discussion of it. But the huge change is in 1967. Just trace now there's a Holocaust museum in every town. There are obligatory Holocaust studies in schools, you know, and so on. Just ask when the huge literature. Just time it. Well, post-1967. What happened in 1967? It's pretty obvious. Israel had taken over the occupied territories. It had won a major military victory. That won out a lot of points here. Being a powerful state wins you points, especially when you're an ally. It needed a justification for denying Palestinian rights and for its illegal settlement programs in the territories. There's no serious debate about their illegality. I could go into it, but the Israeli government itself pretty much recognized it in 1967, so we're going to go on anyway. But had to have a justification for that. And what better justification is there than, look what they did to us. We're free to do anything. And that was, I mean, exploiting the Holocaust as an instrument of oppression of others is just the ultimate obscenity. And there were people who recognized this. My late friend, the late Israel Shachak, Israel's leading human rights activist, and incidentally bitterly slandered and condemned by Dershowitz even as much as Finkelstein. It's an interesting story in itself. But he was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and Bergen-Belsen, got to Israel, you know, Israeli citizen. But after '67, he reacted differently. His reaction wasn't things like this shouldn't happen to us. It's that they shouldn't happen to anybody. And he became a strong, very effective civil rights activist for Palestinian rights, women's rights, other rights. In the early years, he was bitterly detested. There was an effort to try to kick him out of his university position. There was even an article in the press saying somebody should put a bomb over his laboratory door. Vilified. You know, there were efforts to destroy his little civil rights group and so on. In later years, he came to be respected. In fact, he was around 1990, I guess. They select one survivor every year to be honored on the day of the memory of the day of the Holocaust. He was the person picked. His autobiography was published, you know, and so on. He was a respected figure, but not in the early years. Well, that was a different reaction to '67 but the overwhelming one was what I described. And it's easy to trace. I mean, it's so easy to trace that it's even pointless to discuss. You take a look at the journals articles. I mean, any criterion you want. '67 is the turning point. Not because the Holocaust became more important. It was much more important in the late 40s, or the early 40s for that matter. And then, who cares? We don't want to save those survivors. But when it became useful as an instrument to justify oppression, then it became an overwhelming issue. And you know, a lot of grandstanding, and we have to defend the memory of the Holocaust from nobody, because nobody denies it, and so on. In fact, there was a major effort to try to discover Holocaust deniers. If you really look hard, you can find scattered people here and there. I remember there's a book by, what's her name, Deborah Lipstadt, who digs up every Holocaust denier she can find. I was particularly interested because one of them, who nobody ever heard of, was in a college that was right next door to the high school I went to, LaSalle College. Apparently she dug up somebody there. You know, it's just, you really have to work hard to find them. But they were publicized, given as much of a, you know, in France particularly, it was ridiculous, give it huge publicity, so that then you could stand up and say, I'm going to defend the Holocaust against its deniers.
You got in, there was some controversy about you as a defender of a Holocaust, but it was really a free speech issue for you.
That's a straight free speech issue.
Could you address the importance of allowing free speech?
I mean, in the United States, this doesn't happen because free speech is protected here, but it's not in Europe. In France, there's a law. The law was actually passed after this case, but the case in question was a completely unknown, insignificant lecturer at some college who privately published some little papers questioning the existence of gas chambers. If nobody had paid any attention to him, that would have been the end of it. But the French intellectuals decided that they could stand up before the television cameras and show how courageous they are by condemning him and defending the Holocaust from the non-attack and so on and so forth. And there are laws in France which which in effect give the state the right to determine historical truth and to punish deviation from it. Well, that's what he was brought to trial on that. Actually, he wasn't charged with Holocaust denial, but he was charged with allowing others to use his work for nefarious purposes and for not handling documents properly and so on. I mean, it's scandalous. This is like Stalinist Russia. But it's vigorously, passionately defended by the French intellectual classes, and since they can't tell the truth about it, what they say is if anybody opposes granting the state those rights, he's a Holocaust denier. Okay, that's the way intellectuals behave.
Could you discuss how the charge of anti-Semitism is used as a tool to silence dissent?
Well, actually, again, that's not a secret. Abba Eban, one of maybe Israel's leading statesmen, he wrote an article about it, and that must have been 30 years ago in Congress Weekly, I think, the Journal of the American Jewish Congress, in which he instructed American Jews on their duties. And basically what he said is that it's your task to show that critics of Zionism, by that he meant critics of the policy of the State of Israel. There's no such thing. So critics of the policy of the State of Israel, your task is to show that they are either anti-Semites or self-hating Jews, Jews with a neurosis. And that eliminates 100% of criticism. On the second category, he actually named two people, me, of course, and I.F. Stone. We're the neurotic, self-hating Jews. What other reason could you have for criticizing Israeli policies? And that's essentially the point. He was pretty frank. He was unusually frank about it. So we have to stop criticism. We have the weapon of anti-Semitism. We have the weapon of the Holocaust. We have Jewish self-hatred. That makes it 100%. Now, Abba Eban, and in fact every Israeli, knows the Bible. And they know where this comes from. It comes from the Book of Kings, where the King Ahab, who is like the epitome of evil in the Bible, calls the prophet Elijah to him and denounces him, and he asks Elijah, "Why are you a hater of Israel?" Meaning he condemns the acts of the evil king. Well, that's the origin of the notion Jewish self-hatred. And in fact, it's also the origin of the notion of anti-Americanism. The idea is if you criticize the state, you must hate the people, the culture, the society, and so on. It's a deeply totalitarian concept. You can understand it in the old Soviet Union, and you can understand it in King Ahab. It's more interesting when you get it in Abba Eban, or by now almost universally. If there's a Jewish critic of Israel, it must be Jewish self-hatred, like Elijah. And for the rest, anti-Semitism. What can you expect of the Goyim?
A popular theory, still on self-hatred, Jewish self-hatred, a lot of Jewish scholars I've seen argue that there's this thing called Jewish self-hatred and it's an internalization of majority society's hostility to Jews. What do you make of that?
You live in the United States. Is this a society where there's hostility to Jews? Actually, it was. Like, I grew up as the only Jewish kid in an Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, and it was not fun on the streets. It was passionately anti-Semitic and also pro-Nazi. This is the 30s. By the time I got to Harvard in around 1950, you could cut the anti-Semitism with a knife. In fact, one of the reasons MIT, where we are now, became a great university is because people like, say, Norbert Wiener and others couldn't get jobs at Harvard, so they came to the engineering school down the street. There was anti-Semitism. I mean, nothing like it, not horrendous, but it was there. By the 1950s, it basically disappeared. By now, you have to have a magnifying glass to find it. The Anti-Defamation League works overtime to try to find anti-Semitism. So if this is internalized attitudes towards Jews, it would be philo-Semitism, which is a very strong element in American culture, incidentally also English culture. I mean, it's another technique of the kind that you'd expect in a totalitarian culture to try to undercut criticism.
Okay. What about the ADL? What's its purpose now, and how does it function?
Well, the ADL used to be a genuine civil liberties organization. Over the years, it's changed, and again, the point of inflection was 1967, and it became a kind of a Stalinist-style organization justifying policy the state it serves, Israel. It's grotesque, and it's a shame, and it's particularly grotesque because it does have a good record as a civil liberties group, defending rights of Jews, but also others.
I've interviewed Ian Hancock. Do you know who he is? Ian Hancock? He's a prominent Gypsy, and he has great fondness for the things you said about what I'm going to ask you. Could you discuss the way that the Gypsies, the Romani, have been treated by some in the Jewish community per the Holocaust, and why aren't they accepted under the Holocaust umbrella?
Because it has to be unique, just us. It only happened to us, nothing else. With regard to the Roma, the Gypsies, who really are persecuted, in fact, right now they're being kicked out of France, a big scandal in Europe, but they're very badly treated. During the Holocaust, they were treated pretty much the way Jews were. I mean, the proportions killed were probably similar. They were in the concentration camps and so on. But the way they're treated, they're either ignored or it's denied. So there's one Jewish scholar, what's his name, Edward Alexander, out in the University of Washington, who wrote an article, and I think again in the American Jewish Congress Journal, if I recall, in which he described the idea that the Gypsies were subjected to, terrible persecution, as I think his phrase was, an exploded fiction. I mean, if somebody said that about the Jews, they'd be hanged, But he's respected and honored. Actually, he also talked about the fate of Native Americans and American blacks. And he said, well, they were subjected to repression, like the Native Americans were virtually exterminated. And the Founding Fathers were quite frank about it. This hapless race of Native Americans who were exterminating with such perfidious and merciless cruelty, John Quincy Adams and others. They knew what they were doing. But now they were just mistreated, And incidentally, that goes right to the present. It's not just Alexander. You can read there was an article in the New York Review, liberal journal, sensible intellectual journal, about a year ago by a good, serious liberal commentator about American history. He was reviewing a book on American history, and he said an amazing discovery he got from the book was that when Columbus landed, the hemisphere was basically empty. There were about 1 million people from the steaming tropics to the Arctic North, mostly hunter-gatherers, no advanced civilization. He's off by maybe 80 million or so. They had advanced civilizations in North America where we are. We're here because they were exterminated. But it was just an empty hemisphere. I mean, suppose somebody said that about Poland in the 1930s. Well, there weren't a couple of Jews around, sort of odd villages here and there. You go to the companion journal in England, the London Review, and a very well-known historian about a year later says, well, yeah, there was mistreatment of the Native Americans. Was there mistreatment of the Jews in Eastern Europe? These things pass by without comment. Take a look. There's never a letter commenting on it. With regard to the Gypsies, the Roma, it's just an exploded fiction. We don't talk about it.
Could you discuss Orthodox Judaism? What take do you have on groups like Chabad and the Hasidim, which are, as I understand it, increasingly powerful in Israel in terms of laws and so forth? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, I sort of grew up on the periphery of Hasidic communities. My parents weren't in them, but we'd go to their ceremonies on the holidays, a lot of celebration, you know, Sukkot and others. And but now, in recent years, it was, I mean, the kids were in my class and so on. It was just part of the Jewish community. After, again, in the late 60s, for interesting reasons, which I don't think have been explored much, there was an explosion of Hasidic communities, several of them. One of them, the Lubavitcher, are actually like missionaries. So they try to bring young Jews into the community. They recruit, and they've grown enormously. The same is true of some of the others, like the Satmar Hasidim. They're a big community here. In Israel, I think we have to distinguish the Hasidim from the Haredim, the Orthodox Jews, the ones who are studying Talmud all day, and you know, who are mostly they're kind of anti-Zionist. In fact, the more outspoken of them think that the existence of a secular state is an abomination. In fact, the oldest settlers, the original population in Jerusalem, most of it was in Mea Shearim. There's now just remnants of it, but they're still there. Neturei Karta, guardians of the gate, they call themselves. They're passionately anti-Zionist. In fact, they've gone as far as asking Jordan to take back Jerusalem so they can have religious freedom. And they are quite effective. Just this morning, in fact, the newspapers reported that they have now succeeded in blocking, ensuring that government websites are blocked on Sabbath, so that if you want to get your passport renewed on the internet, let's say, you can't do it on Saturday. It's another intrusion into secular life. And they're not a huge part of the population, but they're an influential part. It's a parliamentary system, and they're kind of like a swing vote. And there was an agreement by Ben-Gurion in the early days of the state to essentially grant them they agreed to support the state, which they don't believe in, you know, because the Messiah didn't come. But they agreed to support it if they were given control over essentially a good part of civil life. So you can't get a secular wedding, for example. And if two people want to get married, they don't want to go to an Orthodox rabbi, you go to Cyprus or something like that. And a lot more, kind of and a lot of, you know, they're various. There's a variety of them with different positions. You can't unify it, but they are significant.
This is a general question. How can so many...
I should mention that in the United States, one of the major Hasidic groups, the Satmars, remain very anti-Zionist.
That's interesting. How can so many individuals in the Jewish American community have historically been so active in championing civil rights and social justice in America, but abandon that kind of activism when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What's going on there, do you think?
Again, it's a little bit like what I said about the ADL. There was a time when the ADL was a genuine civil rights organization. And the Jewish community, say in the early 1960s, was mostly highly supportive of the civil rights movement. There were young Jews who went down there and got killed, in fact, participating in the civil rights movement. A lot changed in 1967. I mean, it's not 100%, I don't want to exaggerate, but it's a very significant change for lots of reasons. It wasn't just Israel. There were domestic aspects to it. Do you remember the Ocean Hill-Brownsville conflict in New York?
Is that somebody got killed?
No, there was it was very interesting. What happened in New York, the heavy Jewish community in New York City, of course. You go back to the 1930s, let's say, a lot of them were like my relatives, working class. At that time, unemployed working class, leftist, activists, and so on. Over the years, as anti-Semitism declined and opportunities increased, they kind of worked themselves up into a fairly privileged sector of society. A lot of them, for example, became teachers or worked themselves into the city bureaucracy, kind of like the Irish here. Go back a century here, you have signs saying no dogs are Irish, and now the political system is half run by the Irish. It's the way things have happened here over the years, happened with the Jews too. Well, in the late 60s, the next wave was coming, black and some Hispanic, but mainly black. And they were calling for things like community control of schools. And a conflict developed between the teachers, like my relatives, a lot of them old radicals, who had fought for the civil rights movement, were now part of the ruling bureaucracy. And the poor, who were saying, we want to have a piece of the action. And there was a big conflict called the Ocean Hill-Brownsville thing, and that drove a lot of the Jewish population well to the right. I could see it, And things happening here, of which that was just one dramatic example, and the issue of finding a justification for the occupation and the repression and denial of Palestinian rights, they kind of combined and led to what you're describing. But again, one shouldn't exaggerate. I mean, for a lot of, you take a look at polls, I mean, a large part of the Jewish community just doesn't want to have anything to do with this. You're talking about the active, vocal, articulate part of the community, and yes, it's true of them.
Can I ask you one more, or are we done?
Yeah.
The Mearsheimer and Wallet book, the Israel Lobby, last question.
Yeah.
Could you summarize your disagreements, where you part company with them, and where you connect?
I think it was a valuable book. There's a lot of evidence in it. One problem is they don't say what the Israel Lobby is. I mean, does it include the Wall Street Journal, for example? I mean, the Wall Street Journal, of all the newspapers in the country, is the most extreme in support of Israeli policies. Are they part of the Israel Lobby? Does it include Lockheed Martin, for example, which loves giving military aid to Israel, for obvious reasons? Does it include, say, Intel, which is developing its biggest plant in Israel because it's a favorable area for investment? Does it include the Republican Party, which is much more extreme in its support of Israel than the Democrats are? I mean, are they part of the lobby? Does it include the New York Times? Does it include the American intellectual community, who are, have a terrible record in justifying Israeli crimes? In fact, if you ask who it is, well, it turns out to be pretty much everyone who supports U.S. government policy, which happens to be very favorable to Israel. So what exactly is the thesis? Apart from that, they're overlooking, they are what are called realists in international relations theory. Realist international relations theory regards states as the actors in international affairs, and they pursue something called the national interest, which is a sort of an objective reality that they pursue, and that includes security and so on. Well, this is just not the way international affairs work. You can go back to Adam Smith, who pointed out that policy in England is determined by the people who basically own the society. merchants and manufacturers in his day, and they make sure their interests are taken care of. They don't care what happens to others. That's a large part of what happens up till today. If you overlook the internal structure of a society and the distribution of power inside the society, you're not going to understand much about how foreign policy is made. It's obviously a factor. Well, take a look at lobbies in the United States. The Israel lobby is an influential, AIPAC, say, if that's what you mean, not the Wall Street Journal, not the Republican Party, but AIPAC. They're a powerful lobby. Are they the most powerful lobby? Do they compare with the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, the military lobby? If the business lobbies wanted to put them out of business, they'd do it in 2 minutes. So the idea that the message from their book is, well, for them, the American national interest is harmed by support for Israel. Okay, I don't know what the national interest is. It's different for the CEO of Goldman Sachs and for somebody who cleans his floor. They have different interests, some in common, but not much. But let's imagine that there is a national interest and support for Israel is harming it, the way they claim, whatever this means. That means they're harming the interests of the people who effectively own the society. The financial institutions, Wall Street Journal, of course, is the journal of the business classes, and so on. They're harming their interests. So if we want to change policy, there's a message. Let's put on our ties and jackets, go to the offices of the editorial office of the Wall Street Journal, Intel, Lockheed Martin, American Chamber of Commerce, and explain to them politely that support for Israel is harming their interests. Solve the problem. Does anybody try this? No, because it makes absolutely no sense. For these people, U.S. support for Israel is perfectly consistent with their interests. In fact, they support it. So the lobby's there, undoubtedly, and it's undoubtedly a factor in policy formation, mostly at the fringe. Actually, it's kind of interesting that one thing I didn't like about their book was that, especially their responses to criticisms later, is that there was pretty detailed analysis of how funding of Congress and the parties work by Stephen Zunis, a good American Middle East scholar. And he showed that the effect of AIPAC on, say, congressional votes is pretty slight, and on meaningful votes. Of course, they'll vote on symbolic things which have no consequences, but on real votes. And that, of course, the other major lobbies could wipe him out if they wanted to. Well, they barely mention him in their responses, and when they do, it's just a sort of a serious one-sentence misinterpretation of what he said. Now, what he said is important, and it reflects the way American politics really works. But if you want to be serious about this, you have to ask yourself, is the Wall Street Journal the main representative in the press of the Israel lobby? Is the Republican Party the center of the lobby? If so, what does that mean? Well, who do they represent? It's not a big secret. They represent the business community, the people with overwhelming power inside the country. So what's the national interest?